Greetings and welcome. So, as some of you may have learned about me over the years, one of the things that I enjoy studying is early church history and especially how we got the Bible and some of the major characters and the major events that took place with the canon and how certain books were chosen and certain books were excluded and all that stuff. Well, if you're going to study that topic, one of the names that will come up no matter what you read, it's a very important name, is the name Marcion. Marcion was someone who was born probably towards the end of the first century and died right around 160 in the second century. He's also someone who had a tremendous impact on Christianity. I want to start off this lesson by just telling you a little bit about Marcion and a little bit about some of his thoughts, a little bit about some of his major impacts in early Christianity, and then I want to make a couple of points about that I think could be beneficial to us. So Marcion was raised the son of a bishop, and his father was also wealthy. He seemed to have owned boats, and so Marcion grew up rather affluent. And as he became an adult around the year 140, he ended up moving to Rome. While in Rome, he gave the church this large sum of money and was accepted into Roman Christian society. However, he seems to have been under the influence of some Gnostic teachers and ideas while there, and as he got opportunity to speak, those ideas started to make their way into the churches. And so he didn't last long in Rome, and he got excommunicated, and his large sum of money was returned to him. So Marcion left, and Marcion took his teaching with him. And so he continued teaching, and he continued to have an impact. In fact, he had such a large impact that there were followers called the Marcionites for hundreds of years after his death. He had a rather large following within Christianity. And that is something that caused a whole lot of early church fathers to write about him. So, for example, you have the writings of Tertullian, which is one of our primary sources on Marcion. In fact, he has 5 major books entitled Against Marcion. So Tertullian is a major source, but then you also have Epiphanius, and you have Hippolytus, which is a very famous or well-known heresiologist, I guess you could call him. He wrote a lot about heresies. In fact, he has a book entitled Against All Heresies. And so they all put a tremendous amount on pen or on paper about Marcion. Even before them, in the second century, you have Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, who each also take up the mantle of contradicting and refuting Marcion. So at the end of the day, what's interesting is we don't have anything actually written by Marcion at all. We have quite a bit written about him, though, in all of these different ancient sources, and they all have something in common. They don't like him very much, and they think he's wrong, and they think he's dangerous. There were other groups also within early Christianity that taught a lot of varying and different ideas and different teachings, but we don't have as much on them as we have Marcion. And I think that's an indication of how popular Marcion was. They really needed to address this guy, and they really needed to address his teaching. And so we have an awful lot written about him. As a historian, that becomes somewhat problematic when all of your sources about an individual are clearly biased against that individual. So that leads to some suspicion from time to time about some of the claims that they make about him, but a pretty good case historically can be made for the following things about Marcion and about his beliefs and his ideas. For one, he read the Bible, and well, maybe that's even getting ahead of myself to say he read the Bible, but he had a view of God that there's a lot of pain and suffering and evil and violence and wickedness in this world. And you've probably heard people say something like, if God is all good, then he wouldn't want there to be pain and wickedness and violence. And if God is all powerful, he could stop all the pain and wickedness and violence. So either God's not all good or he's not all powerful. But you can't have an all good, all powerful God because he would eliminate wickedness and violence. And that's a question that Christians have discussed and grappled with over the years. And I think there's good answers to it. But Marcion had an answer. His answer was, God's not good. God is wicked. At least the God who created this world is wicked. He's a wicked God and he created a wicked world. And when you read the Old Testament, you're reading about that wicked God who created this world and then called these people to be his. But look at what he did. Look at how many people he killed. Look at how many wars they went into. Look at what happened to them when they got destroyed and put into exile. He looks at this and it's a terrible story about the terrible events. And he believed that it was a terrible God. Of course, he didn't believe that that was the only God that there was. And this is where things get weird. He believed that Jesus came along and Jesus taught of a different God, a better God. Jesus's God was true and good and faithful, and Jesus didn't teach you to kill your enemy, but to love your enemy. And Jesus didn't teach you to, fight, but to turn the other cheek. And so you look at Jesus and his teaching, and you learn about a completely different God. Even in modern society, sometimes people will talk about the God of the Old Testament as though he's really harsh and cruel. But then, like in Jesus, the God of grace appeared. You have the difference between law in the Old Testament and gospel in the New Testament. You have bad and hard and like wicked in the Old Testament, but you have graceful, forgiving, and loving in the New Testament. Marcion had that view and took it to such an extreme dichotomy that there were actually two different gods. The God revealed in Jesus, who is good and pure in gospel and in good news, in love and grace, and the God of the Old Testament, who created this world, who's wicked and bad and all of that. Okay, so he has these two different views of God. And because of those views, he ends up looking at the world and seeing that the reason there's so much pain and suffering, well, that's because there was a God who created pain and suffering. But that's not the God that I'm going to tell you about. And so that was his way of explaining. And in a pagan world where they believed in many gods, you could actually get a following teaching a message like that. Okay, yeah, the reason you're suffering is because there's a God who has made you suffer. But I know a better God, a true God who comes and is made known through Jesus. So let me tell you about this God, and that could open some people's ears when they start hearing a message like that. And so he has this radical view of two different gods, one good, one bad. Okay, now let's move this doctrine a little bit further. If that one bad God created all the physical stuff out there, then if Jesus was a real physical person, wouldn't that mean that Jesus was created by that bad God? Or at least partook of the fleshly nature that that bad God created? Well, Marcion thought, well, this can't be. And so he also espoused a view that's called docetism. There's a Greek word dokeo or dokein, which would be like it seems, or dokeo would be like I think or I seem. And basically, it's the word that would be used if something seems like something. If something, maybe it's not actually there, but it seems like something is there. And docetism is the view that Jesus, in his physical body, it appeared as though it was there, it looked as though it was there, it seemed as though it was there, but he actually didn't have a real, literal flesh and blood body. And so he was an apparition. He looked as though he was there, but it was like a ghostly type of figure. So people thought that he really was there, but he wasn't actually there. Well, that's going to cause some issues when you start reading through the Gospels, right? Because Jesus does things where it certainly seems like he has a flesh and blood body. For example, the virgin birth, or his genealogy, which connects him to the Israelites. One of the things that goes along with not liking the God of the Old Testament in Marcion's theology is not liking the Jews. He believed that they were the people of that God, but we have nothing to do with them. And so Jesus wouldn't have been a fleshly Jew because, one, he didn't have flesh, and two, he had nothing to do with that God of the Old Testament. As a matter of fact, the God of Jesus had nothing at all to do with this world until Jesus came. So all of that Old Testament stuff has nothing to do with Jesus or the true God. That's all bad stuff. And Jesus came, and he didn't have a flesh and blood body. He merely appeared. He was a purely spiritual being. However, Marcion also had the view, and this is one of the reasons where you kind of wish you had more sources and more info, because he never explains his view of the atonement, of how the death of Jesus brings about salvation. He does believe that the death of Jesus brings about salvation, but it's hard to think of how that's the case if Jesus doesn't actually have blood to shed. How can the blood of Jesus shed on the cross forgive us if there is no blood of Jesus shed on the cross? And so there's different theories that modern scholars kind of have about that. One is that perhaps the God of the Old Testament held everyone captive and enslaved because of their sin and wouldn't release them unless he got sacrifice. And so, in order to appease this God, Jesus tricked him into thinking that he actually died on the cross, when in fact he didn't. But then that God of the Old Testament then was appeased, and so he lets free those who put their faith in Jesus. And so that's one theory of atonement as to how you get the different gods involved, one of them wicked, one of them good, and how Jesus, even though he doesn't actually have a flesh and blood body, could trick that other god into thinking he died. It all gets very complex when you get into it. I think it's interesting stuff to kind of think about, but these are some of the battles that early Christians had. You look through the teachings of Marcion, he was highly ascetic, which means that he taught a denial of the body. So, like, he thought that baptism was essential, to be, was an essential doctrine and practice, but he restricted baptism only to the celibate and to virgins and to people who had given up the right to sexual relations, because he thought even in marriage that's an impure way of life. Why? Well, because it's a physical and carnal thing. And who created all physical and carnal things? Well, it's the God of the Old Testament. And so all of that stuff goes into Marcion's teaching. Now, I want to tell you something else about Marcion. You might be thinking, he's a strange guy. I'm telling you, Christianity, we sometimes get into like arguments with like different denominations and stuff about different points of doctrine or different passages. But if you look at Christianity in the 2nd century, it is a lot more diverse than even all of the denominations today. You know, we at least pretty much agree on the number of gods there are. We at least agree on the canon for the most part. You know, there's the Protestants and the Catholic have a couple more books in the Old Testament. But for the most part, there's a lot of agreement with a few points of differences. If you look throughout church history, especially going back to like the 2nd century, you see all kinds of different views under the umbrella of what people considered to be Christianity. And a lot of these views just seem bizarre to us when we look at them. All right, so Marcion was one of those who had a view that seemed to a lot of people very, very bizarre, but it also attracted a lot of people. It made sense of the world to a lot of people, and so he had a rather large following. Now, the other thing about Marcion you should know is he is the very first person in church history to give us a specific canon list. Canon, with one N, is the word that's used for the set number of books that make up the Christian Bible, or the Bible. You know, like the Jews have a Jewish canon for the Old Testament. And if you were to look at the Catholic Church, they have the same 27 New Testament books as we do. They have a couple of additional books in their Old Testament. Greek Orthodox churches, there's pretty much going to be agreement on the 27 books in the New Testament. Again, they're going to have a bigger Old Testament. If you look at Jews, they're not going to have any New Testament, but they'll have the same as the Protestant Old Testament. And so you look through and you can see there's different canon lists, but for the most part, you go to the New Testament, people have the same 27 books. You go to the Old Testament, and most of the books are agreed upon. There's a couple of them among large religious movements that there's some discussion about. But the canon's pretty well something that most Christians agree on. The deity of Jesus is something most Christians are going to agree on. If you go back to the 2nd century, it's not always that way. What does it look like when Marcion begins making a canon that says these are the books that make up the Bible? These are what people should be studying and reading and getting their doctrines from. Well, if those are his doctrines, his canon might look a little bit different than ours. For example, guess how many Old Testament books he had? 0, not one. Why would he have an Old Testament book? That's a pagan. That God isn't a good God. That's not a God that we learn from. That God has said nothing about Jesus. So when Marcion read the Old Testament, he thought that it told facts. He thought that the history was accurate, but that the history was appalling. And he thought that, okay, yeah, that's true, but it's not anything that teaches us about Jesus. He didn't believe any of the prophecies were about Jesus. He didn't believe Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. He believed that there were prophecies about a Jewish Messiah, but he thought Jesus was a representative of a new God in a completely new thing, not attached to Judaism, a completely new thing. So Jesus is like the new wine in the old wineskin, and that bursts the old wineskin. And so Jesus is something completely new and shouldn't be fit or molded into the thing that's old, like the Old Testament. And so he had no Old Testament. He also took the words of Paul in Galatians 1, where he says, if anyone preaches to you any gospel other than what we have presented, let him be accursed. He took that word gospel to be talking about the books of the Bible that we call the Gospels. So there's 4 of them in ours: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 4 Gospels. Well, Marcion was of the view that there was only one gospel, and there should only be one gospel. And so he only had one book that told the story of the life of Jesus, and that was Luke. He didn't have Matthew, Mark, or John. And there were probably a couple of reasons for this. But even Luke, you might be sitting there thinking, wait a minute, Luke has the virgin birth in it. Luke has a genealogy of Jesus that connects him to like all the way through the Jewish line of the Old Testament, even all the way back to Adam. Luke has like quotations from the Old Testament and all kinds of things. What do you mean he had the Gospel of Luke? Well, one of the things that he is heavily criticized for, Tertullian goes into great detail on this, is that they believed Marcion mutilated his copy of Luke, so that it did not include the virgin birth, and it didn't include the genealogies of Jesus, and it didn't include a lot of these things that would make it not fit well with his teaching. And if you look at Luke and you're trying to say, have a superhuman portrayal of Jesus on the cross, Luke's the best gospel to go to. Because if you read, for example, Matthew and Mark, when Jesus is on the cross, you don't get him talking to people. You get Jesus on the cross, and then there's what's called the cry of dereliction, the Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, where Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then he cries and dies. And it seems like he's in pain and anguish, which is what most of us would feel on the cross. We wouldn't feel like talking to people. But if you look at Luke, Luke is where Jesus is saying, Father, forgive them. They know not what they're doing. Then Luke is where Jesus has the conversation with the thief on the cross, and he tells the man, today you will be with me in paradise. And then Luke is the one where instead of quoting Psalm 22:1, he quotes Psalm 31:5, which says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And then he dies. So like, of the 7 sayings of Jesus on the cross, Matthew and Mark, the only ones you get are, my God, why have you forsaken me? But in Luke, you get him asking for the forgiveness of those crucifying him saving and offering salvation to the thief on the cross, and then him entrusting obedience, offering his spirit up to God. And you look at that and you think, oh, okay, so if one of those is not actually experiencing pain and is just kind of pretending, Luke's the route you go. And that's what Marcion seemed to do. So he took out all the things that contradicted. He chose the gospel that he could most move and mold into his teaching, and that was the gospel of Luke. Now, having said that, it's also important to note that Marcion didn't seem to think that he was mutilating the gospel to fit his own means. He thought that Paul was the only faithful apostle, and all of the other apostles got thrown off and into the false teachings of that evil God, of the Jewish God. See, Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, and he thought all of those other apostles got off track right after Jesus left. And so he thought because of that, a lot of the church was way off track. And so he thought that all of those things that he removed from Luke were actually things that were added by Christians. And so he was purifying Luke and getting it back to its original form rather than taking out all the stuff that he disagreed with. So a lot of different views about what he was doing there. Then, so he had one gospel, no Old Testament, and as for the rest of the New Testament, he had 10 books, and they are the 10 letters of Paul. In the 10 letters of Paul, he makes changes here and there because Paul is very obviously Jewish. And so you're going to have to fix some of Paul's quotations from the Old Testament, remove a few things that the church added to those books, as Marcion would think, and that's how he gets his canon. And so, bam, we have a 66-book canon. Marcion had an 11-book canon. As you can imagine, there were a lot of Christians who responded negatively to his teaching and to his canon. And, we've mentioned a lot of them. Early Christian writers who said that he's changing the books of the Bible and all of this stuff. But you know what the church started to do after Marcion? Because the reality is he was our first to give us an actual set like that. And so when he starts doing that, the church has to respond and say, no, 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 that's not the canon. But then what are they going to say? What is the canon? Well, let me tell you. And so then they start saying, well, this book and this book and this book and this book. And it's only after Marcion that you start getting Christians and church leaders to start giving lists of books that these are the ones that we're going to use and these are the ones that are going to make up our New Testaments. And so that's a really interesting idea. I don't want to say that Marcion's the reason the church came up with a canon. I think they would have anyway. I think, in fact, even before Marcion, we know there were collections of Paul's letters and probably the four Gospels also. But it was certainly after Marcion that the church started very quickly limiting and selecting. These are the ones that we need to follow. That way, you're not adding all these other books to it, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Judas, and these things that are heretical. And that way, we're also not removing things that have early connections to the apostles and to Jesus that we could be learning from. And so, after Marcion, you see the church very quickly start giving lists of books that will become the New Testament. And we know that Eusebius has a list that's very, very similar to ours. And you see that Cyril of Jerusalem, again, lists very, very similar to ours. The book of Revelation was a little iffy in his list. But then Athanasius of Alexandria, 367, his 39th Festal letter, gives us the first that is exactly the same as our 27-book New Testament. But all of that happened, and that ball got rolling largely because of the work of Marcion. So what is all this about? What's the point of this little historical lesson? I think there are a couple of things that we can learn about this that would be helpful for us to understand. Number one is this. Did it sound weird to you when I was telling you those beliefs of Marcion? When I was telling you his thoughts and his theology and all that stuff? Probably did, I would assume. As we move more and more and more into a culture where people are less familiar with Christianity and fewer people have read the Bible, when you tell them your story, when you tell them your beliefs, there's a good chance they'll think of you the way you just thought of Marcion. So my point is, be patient with people. They're hearing something for the first time that's very different than things that they've heard before. They're hearing something for the first time that goes against the way that they've been raised and the worldview that they've been raised in and that they've been taught. And that's going to take a lot of time. That's going to take a lot of patience. That'll take building relationships. That'll take seeing and being part of a community. Just rationalizing someone into your beliefs is going to be a really hard thing to do. And if you expect them to just drop everything and immediately agree with everything you just told them, it's probably not going to work very well. So number one, whenever you're hearing beliefs that are different than your own, that's paradigm shifting, and that takes a while. So when you're evangelizing, have some patience with the people that you are evangelizing. I remember Festus, when Paul is on trial before Agrippa, in Acts 26, actually says to Paul, much learning has made you mad. You might have looked at Marcion and thought, this guy's mad. Well, people might look at you and think, you've gone mad. But it's important, I think, to keep your senses, keep your wits about you, be polite, be kind, keep being the example of Jesus. And over time, your teaching will have more of an impact if you can live in that way. Number two, I think it's interesting that even Marcion doing something that was threatening to the church ended up urging the church to start doing something that was really good. What I mean is, the church, I think, would have come up with a canon anyway. I think the fact that they had the Old Testament, they were already a canon-thinking people. I think the fact that they preferred the Codex to the scroll the Codex is like the book form. You have to choose what books are going to be in there. So kind of by nature, you have to make some of these types of decisions about what books are in and what books are out. After the death of the apostles, it became more and more and more important, especially as the church was growing, to have the words of the apostles, written down, recorded, so that people could continue to learn from them. So there were a lot of reasons I think that canon was a good idea. But what seems to be perhaps the straw that broke the camel's back and got the church actually doing it was Marcion, who said, well, I'm going to do it, and then did it in completely the wrong way. And so it was his heresy or heterodoxy that encouraged the church towards orthodoxy. And when you look at the church in the second century, one of the points that I mentioned was that it was very, very diverse, way more so than like churches within America are today. They had all kinds of different views on all kinds of different things. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons might be that they didn't have a set canon. And so you had all kinds of books. We know of like at least 40 different gospels that were floating around saying all kinds of things about Jesus. And we know that there were all kinds of different beliefs. Actually getting a set canon, and I think along with that, some of the councils where the church actually discussed and hashed out some of these things went a really long way to unifying what was a very, very dangerously diverse movement in Christianity. And so Marcion's heresy kind of got the ball rolling towards a greater and greater orthodoxy, which I think is just another example of the way that God sometimes uses what you would think of as a bad thing to get the ball rolling towards something good. Won't take you very long right now to think of what's something bad that's going on in the world. You could probably come up with a good couple of things. I would say um, don't lose hope, because God very often takes things that you might think of as bad things and brings about good because of them. Joseph's brothers threw him in a pit and then sold him into slavery. That's a bad thing. But it ultimately brought about the salvation of many, many lives as he saved his brothers in Egypt. And so you never know what plan God's working on. So, point number 3, be patient with God. God rarely works on our timetable. God rarely does things as we think he ought. In the same way that God surprisingly brought about good and orthodoxy from heresy, I think you can see that God has the ability to do that. I mean, when you think about from when Jesus was raised from the dead to when the church had a canon, and then when the printing press started making copies of the Bible more accessible, and then when you start thinking about when the Bible started being translated into the languages of common people, I mean, that's a very, very long process from resurrection of Jesus to English translations of the Bible, or even translations into other languages that people can understand. And mass literacy, like all of that stuff takes a lot of time and effort, and it grows in some pockets and shrinks in other pockets, and geography plays a role in time. And yet God is working towards his goals, and God is working towards his plans. He doesn't do it the way that like we would think, why not just zap a Bible down from heaven the first day that the church starts, and that way everyone can have it. Like, you might think that's the way to do it. But what God tends to always do is rely on us to do things for him. What I mean by that is not that God doesn't like answer prayers on his own things, but there's nothing in the world that God asks us to do that he couldn't do himself and that he couldn't do better. And yet, everything that we're called to do, he's relying on us to do it. I mean, God calls upon us to bring the gospel to the world and to evangelize the world. God calls upon us to be generous to our neighbors. God calls upon us to be the light in the world and all of these different things. And you think, God would be so much better at that, yet he's giving us the responsibility to do that. That takes time. That takes trial and error. Sometimes we'll succeed, sometimes we'll fail. We're not as good as God. And so, as God does make changes in the world through his people, be patient. Be patient with one another, but also be patient with him. Marcion uh, created some problems, but over a long period of time, it seems that I don't know many Marcionites, but I do have a nice Bible. And so I think you can look at the way the world goes and be reminded, be patient with God. You don't know what trials right now are producing opportunities for the kingdom and for you. You don't know what difficulties right now might down the road produce something good. And so be patient, work hard, look for opportunities, and keep serving the King. I love you, and may the love of God be with you.